Sophie pressed against me in the elevator and I didn't move. It was a weekend. The building was empty. We were on our way to the basement. Sophie had dropped a box of old paperwork near the storage units and Ethan offered to help. Sophie didn't ask for help. Ethan insisted. Sophie didn't say yes, Sophie didn't say no. Sophie just walked toward the lift and waited for the sound of Ethan's shoes behind Sophie. Ethan followed. The button lit up red. The doors shut. No sound except the flickering bulb above our heads and the buzz of old machinery somewhere beneath our feet. Ethan stood close, closer than needed. There was space. Ethan didn't take it. Ethan's arm brushed Sophie's once, then again. Then Ethan stayed there. Sophie didn't shift. The corner of the box dug into Sophie's thigh. Sophie didn't adjust it. Ethan's hand touched the side of the cardboard, then slid along the edge. Not quickly, not slowly. Sophie still didn't look at Ethan. The elevator stopped 2 floors too early. Ethan pressed the button again. Said nothing. When the doors didn't close right away, Ethan turned and faced Sophie fully. Ethan's breath was shallow. Sophie could hear it catch. Sophie still didn't move. Ethan said. "You're not going to stop me, are you?" Sophie looked at the wall behind Ethan. Beige cracked near the corner. Sophie said, "You already know the answer." Then Ethan stepped in. One arm beside Sophie's head, the other resting on the box, still in Sophie's hands. Ethan's knee brushed Sophie's. Ethan's chest met Sophie's shoulder. Ethan tilted his head, but didn't kiss Sophie, just hovered. Waiting. Sophie didn't turn away. Ethan whispered. "Say it if you want me to stop." Sophie didn't speak. Ethan's hand slid to Sophie's lower back. The heat from Ethan's palms spread through the thin cotton of Sophie's dress. Sophie didn't shiver. Sophie didn't blink. The light flickered again. The elevator jolted slightly. Then the doors finally closed. Ethan pressed in harder. Not rough, not slow. Just forward. The metal behind Sophie made a soft groan. Sophie's heel hit the wall. Sophie shifted the box down to Sophie's hip. Ethan moved with Sophie, breath against Sophie's jaw. No kiss, just wait. Ethan's fingers dug in a little more. Still no words. Sophie tilted Sophie's head slightly. Not to see Ethan. Just to clear space. Ethan's face hovered beside Sophie's. Sophie could feel the static between their temples. When the lift stopped again, the box slipped from Sophie's hands. Hit the floor hard. Paper scattered. Ethan didn't move to pick it up. Neither did Sophie. Ethan's hands held Sophie where Sophie was. The lights didn't flicker that time. They stayed on. Sophie looked at the corner of the mirror panel. A fingerprint smudge caught the glow. Sophie's or Ethan's? Sophie heard a voice echo from the hallway outside. Not clear. Just noise. Ethan pulled back. Not fully. Just enough to breathe. Then leaned in again. Sophie's hand gripped the railing. Cold metal under sweaty fingers. Sophie's back met the elevator wall with a soft thud. No resistance. No struggle. Just sound. Then the doors opened. Sophie and Ethan stood still. Ethan didn't look out. Sophie didn't either. The hallway was quiet. No footsteps. Just that hum from a vent above their heads. Sophie adjusted Sophie's dress. Ethan stepped out first. Sophie picked up the box last. No one said a word. Ethan came home late that night. The front door clicked twice before opening. Sophie was at the sink, not washing anything. Just holding a sponge. Sophie didn't ask where Ethan had been. Ethan didn't say. Ethan walked straight to the fridge. Opened it. Stared. Closed it again. Then stood behind Sophie for 6 seconds. Sophie counted. Ethan didn't touch Sophie. Sophie didn't turn. The water kept running. Neither of them acknowledged it. Ethan brushed past Sophie to the hallway. Sophie heard Ethan pause at the stairs. Sophie dried Sophie's hands. Not fast. Not slow. When Sophie turned, Ethan was gone. Sophie turned off the tap and left the sponge where it was. Sophie didn't clear the dishes. The light stayed on. Upstairs. A door creaked open. Then shut. Not slammed. Just enough to let Sophie know Ethan had no intention of being careful. The next morning Sophie and Ethan sat at the table. Sophie poured Ethan coffee. Ethan added too much sugar. Ethan always added too much sugar. Ethan didn't drink it. Sophie asked if Ethan had plans. Ethan said not sure. Then went back to looking at Ethan's phone. Sophie watched the steam rise from Ethan's cup. It curled to the side, then stopped. Sophie didn't mention the papers still in the elevator. Ethan didn't ask. Around noon Sophie took the laundry basket to the hallway closet. Ethan passed Sophie on the way to the bathroom. They didn't speak. The hallway was narrow. Ethan could have moved. Ethan didn't. Ethan's elbow grazed Sophie's. Sophie didn't flinch. The light was off. They didn't turn it on. When Sophie opened the closet, the scent of detergent rushed out clean sharp. Ethan closed the bathroom door behind Ethan. No lock. Click. Just the shut. That afternoon Sophie folded towels on the couch. Ethan sat beside Sophie. No reason Ethan didn't help. Ethan didn't speak. Sophie could hear the ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Ethan's knee rested against Sophie's. Sophie didn't shift. Ethan's phone buzzed once, then again. Ethan didn't check it. Ethan leaned Ethan's head back. Closed Ethan's eyes. Sophie folded another towel. Ethan exhaled once, loud enough to hear but not comment on. Sophie stood to take the towels upstairs. Ethan followed. Sophie didn't ask. Ethan didn't ask. They reached the top of the stairs. Sophie turned toward the linen closet. Ethan didn't. Ethan went to Sophie's room. Sophie placed the towels on the shelf. Counted them. 7. Sophie heard Sophie's door creak. Sophie didn't go in. Sophie went back downstairs. Ethan didn't follow. Later Sophie stood in the kitchen, peeling the label off a bottle. Small bits of wet paper stuck to Sophie's fingers. Ethan walked in, reached past Sophie to grab a spoon. Ethan's chest brushed Sophie's back. The contact was brief, not necessary. Ethan didn't apologize. Sophie didn't step aside. Sophie threw the label pieces into the trash without wiping Sophie's hands. That night Sophie found the mug on the counter, still wet inside. Sophie hadn't used it. Sophie left it there. The next time happened in the garage. Sophie was looking for a screwdriver. The overhead light was dim. Fluorescent tubes, buzzing like they were burning out. Sophie crouched near the bottom shelf. Dust settled on the tops of paint cans and forgotten boxes. Ethan came in barefoot, said nothing, just stood behind Sophie while Sophie reached. Sophie heard Ethan's breath before Sophie saw Ethan's shadow. Then Ethan's hand brushed Sophie's shoulder. Not a grab. Not soft, either. Sophie didn't get up. Sophie kept looking. The metal of a wrench clinked as Sophie moved a tool tray. Ethan crouched beside Sophie. Ethan's knee touched Sophie's. Sophie kept Sophie's head turned, Ethan whispered. You didn't lock the door, Sophie said. You didn't knock. Ethan didn't laugh. Neither did Sophie. Ethan's hand moved over Sophie's. Not hard, just weight, pressure. Familiar now. Not enough to bruise, enough to know it was Ethan's. The garage smelled like oil and heat. The concrete was cold under Sophie's feet. Ethan leaned forward. Ethan's shoulder pressed into Sophie's. Sophie didn't shift. Sophie's fingers curled under the edge of the shelf. Sophie found the screwdriver, but didn't pick it up. Ethan didn't move away. The house was silent above them. No footsteps. No voices. Just Sophie and Ethan, and the failing hum of the light overhead. Ethan turned Ethan's face toward Sophie's. Still no kiss. Just space getting smaller. Ethan's cheek hovered near Sophie's. Ethan said. This doesn't feel wrong, Sophie said. That's because we're not pretending it is. Ethan didn't answer. Just leaned closer. Ethan's forehead touched Sophie's. The light above them flickered again. The screwdriver rolled away and hit the wall. Sophie stood up slowly. Ethan stood too. Too close. Sophie stepped backward. Sophie's shoulder hit the cabinet. Ethan followed. Sophie reached behind Sophie and found the edge of the workbench. It was dusty. Grit stuck to Sophie's palm. Ethan said nothing. Ethan's hand reached under Sophie's shirt. The cold of Ethan's fingers against Sophie's skin didn't make Sophie gasp. Sophie just kept Sophie's eyes on the wall behind Ethan. A smudge of black where someone had leaned with greasy hands. Sophie pulled away first. Not far. Just enough to reach the door. Ethan didn't follow. Sophie opened it. The hinges squeaked. The hallway was empty. Sophie walked into the kitchen, washed Sophie's hands without soap, and dried them on Sophie's shirt. Sophie didn't look back. Ethan didn't come upstairs for another hour. That night Ethan walked into the living room while Sophie was vacuuming. The cord tangled near Ethan's foot. Ethan didn't step over it. Ethan stood there until Sophie turned the machine off. Ethan asked if they had more detergent. Sophie said yes. Ethan didn't go get it. Ethan just stared at the machine for another few seconds before walking out. The vacuum hummed back on. Sophie didn't move it. The next morning, the smell of something burning woke Sophie. Sophie went downstairs. Ethan was at the stove, bread blackened in the pan. Ethan said, I forgot the toast is broken. Sophie said, it's not. Ethan didn't respond. Sophie picked up the pan. Dumped the toast. Didn't make more. Ethan stood behind Sophie again. This time closer than before. Sophie's hair brushed Ethan's chest. Ethan said. You don't flinch. Sophie said, you don't ask. They didn't touch in that moment, but they didn't need to. Ethan left Ethan's plate on the counter. Sophie didn't wash it. It was raining that afternoon. Sophie stood by the patio door, watching the drops hit the wooden railing. The glass was cold against Sophie's hand. Sophie wasn't thinking about anything. Just watching. Ethan walked in behind Sophie. No shoes, damp hair. Ethan didn't speak. Ethan stood close, not touching. Sophie didn't turn around. Ethan said, do you want to go outside? Sophie said, it's wet. Ethan said, that's why I slid the door open. Stepped out without shoes. The boards were slick. Ethan followed. They didn't look at each other. They stood in the rain, silent. Ethan moved to stand beside Sophie. Ethan's shoulder touched Sophie's. The water soaked through their shirts. Sophie didn't flinch. Ethan reached for Sophie's hand. Sophie let him. Ethan's fingers were colder than Sophie's. Ethan didn't squeeze, just held. The sky was gray. The yard was empty. Sophie heard a car somewhere far off. Sophie didn't care whose. Ethan leaned in slightly. Ethan's chin touched Sophie's shoulder. The rain kept falling. Sophie let go first. Walked back inside. Left the door open. Water pooled on the tile. Ethan didn't shut it. Sophie went to the kitchen. Grabbed a towel. Not to dry off, just to hold something. Ethan walked past Sophie toward the stairs. Water dripped behind Ethan. Ethan didn't look back. Sophie didn't either. That night Sophie heard the door open. Not the front one. The one to Sophie's room. It clicked, then closed. Sophie stayed facing the wall. The hallway light was off. Ethan walked across the carpet. The sound was different with wet socks. Ethan didn't say anything. Ethan stood behind Sophie at the edge of the bed. Ethan's shadow against the dresser. Sophie didn't turn. Sophie didn't ask why Ethan was there. Ethan sat on the corner. Quietly. The bed shifted slightly. Sophie pulled the blanket tighter. Ethan didn't move. Just sat for a long time. Then Ethan laid down behind Sophie. Ethan's hand didn't touch Sophie. Ethan's breath did. Against Sophie's neck. Ethan exhaled slowly. Sophie's shoulder twitched. Not on purpose. Not from nerves. Just the weight of air. They stayed like that until Sophie fell asleep. When Sophie woke up, Ethan was gone. The hallway smelled like wet fabric. There was a sock near the stairs. Sophie picked it up. Put it in the hamper. Didn't look for the other. Later. Sophie was in the pantry reaching for a can. Ethan came up behind Sophie. Ethan's arm brushed Sophie's. Ethan didn't stop. Ethan's hand touched the small of Sophie's back. Then Sophie's hip. Sophie didn't step away. The shelf was full. The air smelled like garlic and rust. Ethan leaned in. Sophie said. Someone might come in. Ethan said. They won't. Sophie stayed. They didn't speak again for the rest of the day. That night, Sophie found Sophie's blouse from earlier, folded on the bathroom counter. Sophie hadn't folded it. Sophie didn't ask who did. The fabric smelled like outside. It wasn't raining anymore. The next day they didn't speak at breakfast. Ethan poured juice into the wrong glass, the one with the crack on the side. Sophie watched it bead near Ethan's thumb. Ethan didn't notice. Sophie didn't warn him. Ethan drank anyway. Sophie picked at toast. Sophie didn't want. Ethan finished Ethan's juice, set the glass down hard. It didn't break. In the afternoon, Sophie passed Ethan on the stairs. Sophie was carrying clean towels. Ethan didn't move. Sophie waited. Ethan didn't go around. Just stood there. Then took 2 steps up. Their faces were level. Ethan didn't say a word. Just reached and took the top towel from Sophie's stack. Sophie let him. Ethan walked past Sophie, brushing Sophie's arm. Sophie stood there until Sophie couldn't hear Ethan's steps anymore. That night, Sophie put on music. Low volume, no lyrics. Sophie sat on the floor with a pile of unfolded laundry. Ethan walked in and sat beside Sophie. Ethan picked up a shirt. Folded it wrong. Sophie didn't correct him. They didn't look at each other. The track changed. Ethan folded another. Sophie didn't stop him. The next morning, the towels were folded again. Properly stacked. Centered on the shelf. Sophie didn't ask who did it. It wasn't Sophie. It happened in the kitchen. Not late, not dark. No alcohol. No excuse. Sophie was making soup. The knife was dull. It crushed the tomato instead of slicing it. Ethan stood by the fridge, watching. Ethan didn't offer to help. Sophie didn't ask. The window above the sink was open. The wind made the curtain shift. There was no music. No build-up. Just air. Ethan stepped closer. Sophie didn't move. The knife sat on the cutting board. Sophie wiped Sophie's hands on the towel. Then left it hanging from the drawer handle. Ethan reached around Sophie. Ethan's chest touched Sophie's back. Ethan grabbed the salt. Poured too much into Ethan's hand. Let it fall slowly into the pot. Some landed on the stove. Burned. Crackled. The smell was sharp. Ethan didn't step away. Ethan's hand rested on Sophie's hip. Sophie didn't speak. Sophie didn't push him. Ethan's breath was steady. Sophie picked up the spoon. Stirred. Ethan leaned in more. Ethan's chin on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie's arm brushed Ethan's. Ethan didn't pull back, Sophie said. Someone might hear us, Ethan said. No one's home, Sophie said. That's not what I asked. Ethan didn't answer. Sophie turned off the stove. They didn't go far. Just to the counter. Sophie leaned forward. The granite was cool. Ethan's hands moved under Sophie's shirt. There was no pause. No hesitation. A pan clattered in the sink behind them. Sophie didn't flinch. Ethan said nothing. Sophie heard Ethan's zipper. Sophie's hands gripped the edge of the counter. Ethan pressed forward. Harder than before. No build-up. Just pressure. The chair behind them scraped back as Ethan stepped forward again. Sophie knocked over the ladle. It hit the floor. They both ignored it. Sophie looked down. There was a smear of tomato on Sophie's arm. Sophie didn't wipe it. The microwave light flickered above. It buzzed. Ethan pushed into Sophie again. Sophie's foot slid against the cabinet door. Sophie felt the vibration through the wood. Ethan said Sophie's name. Just once. Not softly. Sophie didn't answer. Sophie looked at the tiled floor. One of the corners was chipped. Ethan gripped Sophie's waist tighter. Sophie said, "Don't leave a mark." Ethan said, "I won't." Sophie didn't believe him. Sophie didn't care. When it was over, Ethan stepped back. Sophie didn't turn around. Sophie grabbed the towel, wiped the counter. Then wiped Sophie's hands. There was soup on the edge of the pot. It had burned slightly. Sophie stirred it. The smell changed. Ethan stood at the door. Watching. Ethan said. "You don't even shake," Sophie said. "You don't even blink." Ethan left the kitchen. Sophie sat down at the table. The chair was warm. Sophie didn't eat. Sophie didn't clean up. Sophie left the ladle on the floor. Sophie left the salt ring on the counter. Sophie didn't check the lock on the door. That night Ethan texted Sophie from the other room. "Still thinking about it?" Sophie didn't reply. Sophie deleted the message. Then wiped the screen with Sophie's sleeve. The phone buzzed again. Sophie turned it face down. Didn't turn it off. Sophie lay in bed in the clothes Sophie cooked in. The tomato stain was dry. Sophie smelled like steam and garlic. Sophie's thighs ached. Sophie didn't shift. Sophie didn't cry. Sophie didn't sleep. At some point near morning Sophie got up. Walked to the kitchen. The pot was still on the stove. The soup had congealed. Sophie didn't throw it out. Sophie didn't reheat it. Sophie stared at the clock. Sophie doesn't remember what it said. Sophie opened the fridge. Closed it. Sophie's fingers left prints on the handle. Sophie didn't wipe them. The ladle was still on the floor. Sophie kicked it gently with Sophie's foot. It spun once, stopped. Sophie stood there until the hallway light turned on by itself. Motion sensor. Not Sophie's. Nora found Ethan's phone. It was on the bathroom counter. Ethan never left it there. It buzzed once, then again. Then stopped. Nora picked it up. Sophie saw Nora through the mirror. Nora was brushing Nora's hair. Then paused. Screen still lit. Nora's thumb hovered, then tapped. Then again. Sophie didn't say anything. Nora didn't say anything either. Nora set the phone down slowly. Turned off the light. Left the room. The silence behind Nora was heavy. That night Nora made dinner without asking what anyone wanted. The food was cold. The plates were too full. Ethan didn't eat. Nora didn't eat. Sophie moved food around with Sophie's fork. The sound was loud in the quiet fork against ceramic. No one looked at anyone. Nora cleared the table before they were done. Took Ethan's plate first. Then Sophie's. No questions. No expressions. Later Nora came into Sophie's room. Sat on the edge of the bed. Held a laundry basket. Nora didn't need. Nora said, "Do you want to tell me something?" Sophie said, "No." Nora nodded once. Looked around the room. Eyes never landing on Sophie. Nora said, "I raised you." Ethan said from the hallway. "You didn't." Nora stood up slowly. Walked out without a word. Ethan stayed in the hallway. Sophie heard Ethan's breath. Sophie heard the creak of the floorboard near the lamp. Ethan didn't come in. Sophie didn't invite him. The door stayed open. No one closed it. The next morning Nora didn't speak. Nora made coffee. Poured 1 cup. Not 2. The second mug stayed upside down on the drying rack. Ethan walked in. Saw it. Said nothing. Nora left the room. Nora's keys were already in Nora's hand. Nora didn't come back that night. The dog barked at the back door. They both ignored it. The light stayed on in the kitchen. The microwave blinked. 12. 12Z0. 12. Neither of them fixed it. They sat on opposite ends of the living room. Ethan didn't look at Sophie. Sophie didn't speak. At some point Ethan stood. Walked behind Sophie. Ethan's fingers brushed Sophie's shoulder. Sophie flinched. Ethan paused. Then walked away. The dog barked again. Sophie got up. Let it out. The night air was cold. Sophie didn't shut the door right away. Sophie stood in the gap and looked out. The yard was empty. Nora came back the next afternoon. The front door was quiet. Nora didn't take off Nora's coat. Nora's shoes stayed on. Nora walked to the table. Placed a folder on it. Opened it. Spread out papers. Bank lease names. Numbers. Nora didn't speak. Ethan walked in. Saw it. Said seriously. Nora didn't answer. Just pointed at the line with Ethan's name. Then Sophie's. Then Nora's. Nora tapped once. Said undo this. Ethan laughed. A short sound. Dry. Sophie didn't speak. Nora didn't look at Sophie. Ethan said. You're overreacting. Nora said. You're disgusting. Then Nora turned to Sophie. Nora didn't shout. Nora didn't cry. Just stared. Then said me. Con la Chatanua. Nora's voice was flat. Nora left the folder open on the table. No one touched it for days. The night after that, Nora's room stayed locked. The light under the door didn't move. Sophie heard footsteps pacing once. Then nothing. A cabinet slammed. Water ran. Nora didn't speak to Sophie. Nora didn't leave a note. The house felt smaller. Not quieter. Just tighter. Like walls shifted inward. The folder stayed on the table. The papers curled at the corners. Ethan walked past them every day. So did Sophie. No one moved them. No one threw them out. They all just walked around them, like they weren't there. Nora stopped talking to both of them. No eye contact. No questions. Nora passed by Sophie like Sophie was furniture. Ethan kept moving through the house, like it was still Ethan's. Sophie noticed how often the doors stayed open now. No one shut anything anymore. Not drawers, not cupboards. Not mouths. Just space and movement and things. Half finished. One morning, Sophie walked into the living room, and Nora was already sitting there, dressed coat on bag in Nora's lap. Nora looked at Sophie once, then at the window. The sky was gray. Sophie waited. Nora didn't speak. Just sat. Sophie turned on the kettle. Nora didn't drink tea. Sophie poured one for Sophie. Let it go cold on the table. The smell of dust stayed in the hallways longer than usual. No one vacuumed. No one swept. There were stains on the banister thumbprints. One was Sophie's. The others, Sophie didn't check. Sophie found one of Ethan's shirts in the laundry. Sophie hadn't folded. Sophie left it in the basket. Sophie didn't touch it again. Ethan came to Sophie's room 2 nights later. Sophie didn't ask why Sophie was already sitting on the floor. Folding nothing. Holding nothing. Ethan sat down next to Sophie. The carpet felt damp underneath. Neither of them moved. Sophie heard Ethan's breathing. Sophie didn't mimic it. Ethan placed Ethan's hand on Sophie's ankle. Sophie didn't pull away. Ethan didn't move higher. Just stayed there, like Ethan had a right to. Like Sophie didn't need to react, Ethan said. Nora's going to leave, Sophie said. I know. Ethan said. Nora'll tell everyone. Sophie said I know. Then Ethan asked. What are we supposed to do? Sophie didn't answer. Ethan kept Ethan's hand there for a few minutes. Then took it away. Sophie went downstairs later. Nora's bag was still on the table. The folder was gone. Sophie didn't look for it. The hallway smelled like Nora's perfume, only barely. The kind Nora used to keep in Nora's glove box. Nora never wore it at home, just when Nora had somewhere else to be. The back door was open. Ethan was outside, smoking. Sophie didn't know Ethan smoked. Sophie watched Ethan from the kitchen. Ethan's shoulders moved with each breath. Ethan didn't look in. Sophie didn't go out. The cigarette burned low in Ethan's fingers. Then Ethan crushed it on the concrete step. Sophie watched the smoke drift up. Then disappear. Sophie started sleeping on the couch. Not because Sophie wanted distance. Sophie just didn't want a room anymore. Ethan didn't ask where Sophie went. Nora didn't say anything either. Sophie folded a blanket and used a sweater as a pillow. The ceiling had a water stain Sophie hadn't noticed before. It looked like a handprint. If Sophie tilted Sophie's head, Sophie stared at it every night until Sophie's eyes blurred. In the morning, Sophie made coffee for Sophie. Didn't offer anyone else. The cups stayed where Sophie left them. No one washed anything. The smell of burnt soup was still in the microwave. Sophie didn't clean it. Ethan didn't either. No one talked about what came next. They just sat in it. That evening, Sophie opened the fridge. Stood there for a full minute. Not hungry. Not deciding. Just looking. Sophie heard a drawer open behind Sophie. Then close. Then silence. Sophie closed the fridge. Left the kitchen light on. Walked upstairs. Didn't go into any room. Just stood at the top step. Listening. There was nothing to hear. Nora moved out 2 weeks later. No announcement. No scene. The car was gone by the time Sophie came downstairs. Nora's room was empty. Drawers pulled out. Mattress. Bare closet door. Left ajar. A hanger dangled sideways on the rod. The floor was swept. Clean, as if Nora had never slept there. No note. No message. Just absence. Ethan didn't say anything about it. Sophie didn't ask. That night they watched TV in silence. Static on a blue screen. The remote was on the table. Neither of them touched it. The light from the screen flickered across Ethan's face. Ethan didn't blink much. Sophie kept looking at Ethan's fingers. They were still resting on Ethan's leg. The same fingers that used to trace Sophie's spine, when no one else was home. Sophie looked at Sophie's own hands. One nail was cracked. Sophie peeled it without thinking. It bled. Sophie didn't get a tissue. Sophie slept on the couch again. The blanket had a hole in the corner. Sophie pulled it tighter. The light in the hallway was still on. No one turned it off. Sophie stared at the ceiling. The handprint stain was darker now, or maybe Sophie imagined that. It had started to look like something else. Not a hand. Something that pressed down harder. Sophie closed Sophie's eyes. Didn't sleep. In the morning, Sophie opened Nora's old drawer. It smelled like lavender and wood polish. Nothing inside but one safety pin and a single penny. Sophie didn't take them. Sophie closed the drawer. Didn't open it again. The room stayed quiet. The windows stayed shut. Ethan left Ethan's shoes by the front door. Wet from rain. Sophie didn't bring them in. Sophie stepped around them every time Sophie went out. They stayed there for days. Sophie started counting how long it would take before Ethan moved them. On the 5th day, Sophie threw one in the trash. Ethan never asked where it went. They didn't touch again. Not once, not even by accident. Ethan sat on the couch. Sophie stayed at the table. Ethan took the hallway. Sophie took the stairs. Their paths crossed without sound. They shared oxygen, but nothing else. One night Sophie walked into the garage. Not to find anything. Just to stand there. Sophie turned on the light. It buzzed. Then went quiet. Sophie sat on the concrete floor. It was cold. Sophie leaned against the workbench. Sophie's back hurt. Sophie didn't move. The screwdriver was still there, under the shelf. Rusted. Sophie didn't pick it up. The house smelled like silence, not mold, not food, just stillness, like dust trying not to disturb itself. The microwave still blinked. Stirred. Sophie never fixed it. Ethan never noticed. Sophie started walking more. Around the block. Around the yard. In loops. No destination. Just pacing. Sometimes Sophie forgot to wear shoes. The sidewalk scratched Sophie's heels. Sophie didn't care. Sophie kept walking until Sophie's legs burned. Then came back inside and